path to communism laid out in classical Marxism is both simple and rigid. It's simple because it involves a linear sequence of historical economic forms: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and finally, through socialist revolution, communism. It's rigid because this sequence is unavoidable. There are no alternative paths or shortcuts to communism. Under primitive communism, pre-state extended kin, cultural groups, tribes or clans if you must, do not universally enforce private property, but collectively divide up duties and goods based on necessity, capability, and need. Under those conditions, some of these groups develop coercive, sophisticated hierarchies, which increase their capacity to dominate other groups. They conquer those groups and turn them into property for the exploitation of their labor through slavery, giving rise to ancient civilizations such as Babylon, Egypt, and Rome. Primitive communist groups still existed alongside slavery-stage societies, often described as barbarians by their civilized neighbors, with both war and trade occurring between them. Sometimes the barbarians even won those wars, usually setting themselves up as the new masters of a slave society, rather than abolishing slavery as a structure. Technological development, together with increasing population density, shifted the economic basis of these larger societies away from the direct exploitation of labor through slavery to exploitation of land through bonded peasant or serf labor, giving rise to feudalism. Feudal societies continued to develop technologically and administratively, giving rise to capitalist economies where direct control of land was supplanted by indirect control through capital, that is, the means of production: land, labor, technology, administration, etc. From collective effort to people as property, to land as birthright, and finally to capital as claim on social productivity, these were the stages of Marxist development. The ladder each country had to climb before it was ready for communist revolution. While each system was exploitative and abusive in its own way, it was also necessary for the development of technology and science, the creation of infrastructure, and the evolution of the means of production. Only once capitalism had run its course, with the tremendous human suffering that entailed, would a country have the industrial base to allow for the emergence of communism. Until that point, Marxists in less developed countries were urged to support the most progressive forces, often liberals and capitalists squaring off against anachronistic feudal structures, to hasten the day the country would be ready for communism. When 19th century Russian Marxists approached Marx seeking guidance on furthering revolution in Russia, that's the advice he gave: support the liberals, help build capitalism, much to the disappointment of his Russian disciples. Despite the clear judgment of Marx himself, there were Russian Marxists, most notably Lenin himself, that argued for socialist revolution in Russia, level of development be damned. Orthodox Marxists such as Georgi Plekhanov pleaded with him to reconsider. Without industry to take over from capitalists, a socialist government would be forced to industrialize by itself under conditions of general underdevelopment, with coercive exploitation of mass labor the only potential method of raising the investment needed for industrialization. The human cost on the very classes essential for the success of communism, workers and peasants, would be catastrophic, with mass repression required to extract sufficient value, and the moral blame for this would be laid squarely on socialism, tarnishing its reputation everywhere and for all time. Better stick to the plan and let Russian capitalists do the dirty work of primitive accumulation while Marxists organized and bided their time. Lenin, however, had a rejoinder to this argument, one which revised the entire Marxist developmental scheme. That scheme was based on distinct national economies developing on their own, with a separate trajectory for each country. Imperialism, Lenin argued, had reoriented the entire global economy, creating an international capitalism that transcended political borders and nullified the old developmental process. Russia was not an underdeveloped feudal national economy moving towards capitalism, but a raw resource producer for international markets with a harsher degree of exploitation imposed upon it. There was no inevitable catch-up for the Russian economy, or the Brazilian, Indian, etc., since persistent underdevelopment coincided with the structure of international capitalism. Waiting for capitalist maturity to stage the socialist revolution risked deferring it forever. Conversely, Russia's connection to the global economy created a mechanism to export revolution into the rest of the world, especially to core Western economies. The revolution might start in Russia, but it would not end there. Inspired, emboldened, and coordinating with the new Russian socialist state, Western Marxists launched their own plays for power, with workers' uprisings all across Western Europe. The Red Army would sweep in from the east to link up with its European comrades, who would deliver Western industry to the cause of international socialism. That capacity, the industrial might of Germany, France, and other advanced countries, would industrialize Russia, not the blood and sweat of Russian workers and peasants, avoiding the nightmare outcome described by Plekhanov. Russian leadership was all the more necessary since capitalism in the core countries, especially the UK, had started sharing profits, ever so minimally, with workers, creating a pampered labor aristocracy unlikely to risk the material comforts it won for the sake of an uncertain proletarian revolution. Just like waiting for Russia to economically catch up, waiting for the workers of advanced countries to rise up risked deferring the revolution forever. So the USSR was never the plan. The October Revolution that overthrew the Kerensky government and ushered in the Soviet Union was merely the first phase in what was intended as an international revolution to seize the machinery of advanced capitalism and introduce communism on a global scale. Despite the exacting toll the revolution took on Russia, triggering general war and foreign intervention across the length of the empire, a process that would drag on for 5 years and cost between 7 and 12 million lives, Lenin maintained an international orientation. He coordinated with Western leftists, including British trade unions that held up arms shipments to the USSR's enemies, and German, Austrian, and Hungarian communists that staged strikes and revolts in anticipation of Soviet arrival. And as soon as the Russian core was secure, the Red Army reorganized, he launched a Western offensive that would finally unite Eastern and Western socialists and secure the productive potential of capitalist industry for the global working class. This was the revolution's final phase, on which the entire outcome depended. There were setbacks, to be sure. The most radical uprisings in the West, Luxembourg and Leibniz's Spartacist uprising in Germany and Belakun's Hungarian Soviet Republic, proved short-lived, the first failing in a few days and the second lasting 5 months. They were also premature. An independent, non-communist Poland had sprung up after World War I, splitting the Soviet Union off from the European core. Reaching European industrial centers and linking up with Western communists would mean marching through Poland. The Soviet-Polish conflict had only just begun in 1919, when European leftist militancy reached its peak. Worse, the early phase of the war saw Poland on the offensive, pushing deep into Ukraine and Belarus, with the Red Army only regaining the initiative in 1920, after the Central European socialist uprisings had been suppressed. Nonetheless, the left remained powerful throughout Central Europe, and Red Army successes in 1920 triggered a general Polish rout, chasing the Poles from Kiev to Warsaw over June and July. On August 12th, 4 Soviet armies of 24 divisions, approximately 140,000 men, converged on Warsaw to finally topple the teetering Polish Second Republic. Polish forces were only slightly smaller, but exhausted and demoralized by their desperate retreat through Ukraine and eastern Poland. A Soviet victory would wipe out the last barrier to Central Europe and bring the invigorated Red Army into contact with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian successor states, politically chaotic and military hollowed out by defeat in World War I. Lenin's plan was about to succeed, and the Russian Revolution was about to truly go global. And then, over 2 weeks, the Polish force in Warsaw engaged each of the 4 armies separately, converting an overall numerical disadvantage into superiority in detail. The Poles had learned how to intercept and decode Red Army communications, allowing them to surprise and counter Soviet forces with devastating results. By August 21st, the last organized Soviet resistance in Poland was broken, with inevitable Soviet victory becoming ignominious Soviet rout. The Soviet defeat was so decisive that the USSR was forced to abandon any hope of westward expansion, signing an unfavorable 1921 peace in the Treaty of Riga to end the conflict. The consolidation of the Polish Second Republic and the continuing violence of the Russian Civil War put Western industry out of reach for a generation, forcing Lenin into the scenario he had so confidently dismissed when Plekhanov presented it. He stood as the leader of a socialist country without industry to socialize, forced either to create it himself through labor exploitation and repression, or accept long-term underdevelopment in a hostile global environment. The USSR alone was never the plan, but now it was the reality that he had to somehow deal with.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can catch the live stream of This is Revolution every Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This is Revolution.